Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Personal Responsibility Lawyer Podcast. I am your host, Michael Lovins. I'm one of the founding trial lawyers of the law firm Lovins Trosclair. More about us later, but first, most importantly, let me tell you about my guest today. My guest is an example of why it's good to have friends in high places, and one reason that it's good to have friends anywhere, including in high places, is that your friends have friends. And that's how I was able to connect with Dr. Richard Johnson, who is my esteemed guest today, and I mean that in the sincerest way. He is the director of the Booker T. Washington Initiative at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. The Booker T. Washington Initiative examines the effects of public policy on African American communities. I'm going to describe a little bit of his experience prior to taking the helm at the Booker T. Washington Initiative, but I'll warn you that it would be easier for me to tell you the things he hasn't done. But I ain't got all day here, people. Come on. He was chief of staff to some elected officials in both state and municipal governments. In those roles, he's been a major player in crafting policies that are related to public safety, public works, housing and community development, healthcare, and workforce development. Dr. Johnson, his doctorate is in education administration, and he has been an educator for over 20 years. In that role, he's done a lot of research on treating cocaine and heroin addicts. He has counseled a lot of troubled inner-city adolescent males. For almost 20 years, he was president of the Louisiana Prison Chapel Foundation. And on top of all of that, he is a veteran of the U.S. Army. I've left a bunch of stuff out, but that gives you a pretty good overview. Dr. Johnson, welcome to the Personal Responsibility Lawyer.
Thank you so much for having me on today with you, Michael. I am looking forward to a good discussion on public policy and how we can make some positive changes in America today.
So thinking of positive changes, so my life is enmeshed with Louisiana all over the place. My wife's from Louisiana. My law partner's from Louisiana. You are a good Texan, but you were president of the Louisiana Prison Chapel Foundation. How did a good Texas kid get mixed up in Louisiana?
That's what Governor Foster's wife asked me years ago. How does a Texas boy get to be president of the Louisiana Prison Chapel Foundation? Well, my family's been here in Louisiana since before the early 1800s, and we've owned our farm down here since about 1881. And my parents they moved to Houston, but I was the only one actually born in Houston. My siblings were born here in Louisiana. And really, I'm the only person in my family who was born in Texas. And so I travel both back and forward to Louisiana frequently. I'm actually out here on our farm now for the holidays. And I'm glad I really just stepped off of my tractor and walked inside and got on the line with you, Mike, because I think what we have to talk about today is so important.
Well, thank you very much for getting off the tractor. And that actually, as someone who spends no time on a tractor, it's hard work, I know. And I'd like to spend a little more time on a tractor, on a horse or something. But so for a little context for our listeners, we're recording right now on July 3rd, 2020. If you're listening to this in the distant future, it's worth knowing a bit of the context of what's going on in the world right now. We've been seeing mass protests, some that have devolved into looting and rioting following the killing of George Floyd by the police in Minneapolis. All of the stuff that's going on has dramatically increased awareness about race in America and a lot of the disparities between Black people and white people and various minorities and the outcomes that we're seeing. And a lot of unrest has arisen as a result of that. And I want to start with a broad question of where are we on race in America today? And you can kind of take that wherever you go, because it's something that you could, get another PhD in, and we don't have that much time. But just in a broad sense, where are we on race right now?
I think we've come a long way in terms of race relations, and we still have a long way to go. No doubt, the history of African Americans here in North America is rich with progress, it's rich with growth, but it's also stained somewhat with the tarnishment of slavery, Jim Crow, and policies that basically created a separate and unequal society based on race. And so part of our growing that we have to do right now is transform those policies to make it not separate but united and equal. So we go from separate and equal, but to united and equal, and then understanding the growing pains of America are laced with slavery and free labor, and much of that came off of the back of slaves. We understand that, and so we have to then look at those folks and say, well, hey, we're all equal now, so let our policies reflect that.
So you mentioned policies that have created a separate and unequal society. Plessy versus Ferguson many years ago said separate but equal was acceptable, and then later that was reversed by the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education. But we still have, as you said, separate and unequal. What are the policies that we have had that have created that? And how much of it is policy and how much of it is something that's something other than policy?
I think that there's a portion of it that's policy driven, and then there's the significant amount of it is non-policy driven, is just practice driven. It's great to integrate social settings, bars, restaurants, workplace areas. It's great to integrate those, but it's also great in America to integrate the economic side of things, where not just African Americans, but all Americans have a fair and equal shake at the great American dream in terms of achieving high-paying, well-paying jobs, entrepreneurial opportunities. And I think that where we find the most difficulty is through the economic space, as opposed to other spaces. The social space, I think we're socially integrated well, but we're probably about 1% or 2% economically integrated equally.
Why? Why has the economic integration not occurred, at least not to the extent?
Yeah, simply because, America is not a social democracy, and is not a communist, and is not a socialist country. It is a capitalist nation. So we run off of our economy. And so as our economy goes, so as we go. So basically, there has been a glass ceiling there for African Americans, and that's where we have some of the past vestiges of slavery, that mentality, that mindset that spills over into today's space. But that's where we have to work very, very hard in terms of moving the African American community forward in the economic stimulation and development space. And I've seen some of that mobility happening with this current administration as opposed to others.
What has been causing what has the current administration done that has improved the economic integration?
Well, they've created opportunity zones. I think that was a huge step in the right direction, in creating opportunity zones where African Americans live, concentrated in certain areas, where it encouraged investment going back into the Black community that would create jobs as well as open opportunities for entrepreneurship and economic growth. So that has only been created within the last 2 years. And as you know, it takes a little time for those things to grow, but we went from zero to there. So that's one step in the right direction. The Next Step Act in criminal justice reform was a huge step for us who have been out on the battlefield fighting for freedom, justice, and equality for decades, to see that policy come into play. So the Next Step Act, criminal justice reform, opportunity zones, economic development and stimulation reform, those are some of the things we can handle through policy. Now, practice is something different. We have to have relationships established with small businesses as well, along with large businesses within different industry sectors, to open up opportunities for African Americans to, number one, start their own business, number two, grow their business, and number three, by doing so, employ other people.
Can you back up on opportunity zones? I know the term, but can you tell us more specifically what an opportunity zone is?
Opportunity zones focus primarily on areas within the African American community where they're economically depressed, and provide incentives for investors to come in and basically set up their businesses within those economically depressed areas, and also seeks to bring in more African American entrepreneurs that basically have started their business, maybe struggling with their business, and get certain tax credits that would allow them to grow their business in the African American community, which is a huge step in the right direction. We have not seen, the federal government take a step in the economic development and stimulation space in the African American community until within the last 2 years, which is a major and significant symbolic step, as well as realistic and actual practical step to stimulate financing in the urban centers of America. That was huge, not just to create jobs, but to open up the door for Black-owned businesses to thrive, flourish, and grow.
What does it take to kind of in the practice part? You mentioned these are policy things, but then there's also the practice. What are the things that need to happen to really maximize harnessing the power of the Black community to create businesses, to create jobs, to create economic opportunity for not just for people? I mean, it's one of those things where people who live in all white neighborhoods benefit from primarily Black neighborhoods doing well economically. Those things, I don't think a Black entrepreneur wants to just have a business that employs and serves Black people as opposed to white people. Wants to have a business that serves people. But how in the practice part of this, how do we what things need to happen to really harness and maximize these opportunities?
The main thing that needs to happen is, as you know, creating a law or a policy is the first step. Implementation is the hardest step. If you go back and you mentioned Plessy versus Ferguson, and you also mentioned the laws that created an opportunity for integrating schools. But the implementation of the laws took time. But if we have a top-down approach in terms of using the bully pulpit of the highest seat in the land to tout economic development and stimulation within the Black communities, utilizing the opportunity zones and setting up an infrastructure to do so, then that's how you get it done. It's one thing to have a law, it's another thing to implement that law or implement that policy.
Mm-hmm.
So now that the administration has put that policy in place, it's up to the administration to take the bold steps necessary to implement those policies in the Black community. And that's where we'll see a change happen.
I want to talk a little bit about the education gap, and then the First Step Act that you reference, the criminal justice reform. One of the things that it I hope addresses is the fact that young Black males are incarcerated at a massively higher rate than other demographics. And there's what I've heard referred, in fact, I think in our earlier conversations, you referred to the school-to-prison pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us about that, and what is it? Why is it? What are we dealing with on that?
Well, the school-to-prison pipeline is a direct result of the correlation between failing schools and a thriving criminal justice system. Now, in order to drill down to the root of the problem, I'll do that very quickly for you. If you go back to the 13th Amendment, the 13th Amendment basically says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist except for punishment when an individual has been duly convicted of a crime. So basically, that leaves a loophole for slavery to continue to exist. That was the only way Lincoln could have gotten it ratified in 1865. The votes to ratify was have a loophole for slavery to continue to exist. So right after that, the ratifying of the 13th Amendment in 1865, you saw major prisons spring up and the relationship between prisons and plantations. So then a Black man would be arrested, and say you were spitting on the sidewalk. And so we're going to arrest you and put you back on the plantation. Actually, it was now called a prison. And if you look at Louisiana, the Louisiana State Penitentiary, Angola, is actually two plantations put together. One was 8,000 acres and the other one was 10,000. So now it's an 18,000 acre prison, which houses about 8,000 mostly Black men, about 90%. And so basically this allowed slavery to continue to exist. So there's always been an incentive through the criminal justice system to arrest young Black men and put them back on the plantation. Now, how do we deal with that? How do we reverse that? Well, two ways. We have to work on the prevention side, which is making schools successful, education successful, because a thriving education system will starve out a criminal justice system. And then for those individuals who are incarcerated right now, we would have to intervene with programming inside of the prisons through education and through career technology education, basically providing them with skill sets, certifications to become productive when they come out of prison so that they can tie into industry and not go back into the criminal justice system. And the same thing we have to do on prevention is to increase career technology education programs, because not every kid is going to go to college and not every kid should go to college. Simply because our system is not designed for everybody to go get a liberal arts and science degree. Some of us will fare well in plumbing, in the trades, will fare well in carpentry, will fare well in IT areas that do not require a degree. So we have to make our education system robust enough to close off the school to prison pipeline and start putting people to work instead of sending them to the penitentiary.
Now, you have some experience in some education programs that address exactly what you're talking about. Tell us about the programs that you've been involved in and then the results that have been witnessed as a result of these.
Absolutely. I've been involved in, my doctorate is in education, so I've designed programs. I've designed and implemented student success programs at Texas Southern University, St. Philip's College, Wiley College, and those programs have been highly successful in, number one, retaining student engagement and elevating student engagement, and increasing graduation rate. I designed the Johnson 3M model through my dissertation in research. And the 3M is manage, monitor, and motivate students toward academic success. And we've seen in those three institutions, we've seen a higher than 10% increase in retention rates and grade point averages, about an increase in 2 points on grade point averages in the first year. So those are highly successful programs that are working in colleges and universities right now. But I also, through a policy, was able to write the Texas student peer mentoring work study program. Now that is now the law for the state of Texas. And what it does is it pays upper class students who are well acclimated to the institution, both socially and academically, to become peer mentors for incoming freshman students. And it pays them $10 an hour to do that and help mentor new students coming into the system. And that has increased our graduation rate and our persistence rates across the board. So I've been working at increasing the effectiveness of education and student success for about the last 15 years because of my dedication to create a strong education system and decrease the amount of folks going into the prison system.
In the 3M, manage, monitor, and motivate, describe how you motivate in this context.
Absolutely. You have to have highly motivated teammates working with students. You have to, number one, you have to manage students. You have to make sure that they have a very sound academic program that leaves very little to no room for failure. And then you have to, after you manage them, you have to monitor that, through weekly reporting. And after monitoring that, at the same time, you have to motivate them. You have to tell students how well they're doing. You have to always have an uplifting word for them, and an encouraging word, because that's what helps human beings become successful. When people encourage you and provide those sort of affirmations for you on a daily basis. So what we do in that program, we manage, monitor, and motivate students toward academic success. We don't subscribe to any negative language that would bring students down. Our total culture is about building students up.
A kid in middle school, high school, how do you analyze and deal with the effects of the home life and how that we can't expect kids to come into school and completely leave home life behind? That's not realistic. It's not realistic for any of us to go into whatever our place of work is and act as if we don't have a life outside of that. What's going on in that? And you mentioned to me in our prior conversations the importance of the family in all of this. I guess just tell us a little bit more about how all of that works together.
One of the things that we do, Mike, is we look beyond just the IQ, the intelligence quotient. We look beyond IQ, and look into what I have coined the EQ, the environmental quotient, because I noticed, let's just take Houston, which is now the fourth largest city in the United States of America. You take the city side of Houston, and right, let's take Yates High School in the middle of Third Ward in Houston. So if a student lives there, they have to pass by, on their way to school, they have to pass by drug addicts, they have to pass by people stealing, alcoholics, people drinking on the street. They have to walk through that and then get to their school. Now, once they get to school, they're expected to perform, and they're in competition with students who've seen none of that in their lives. And most of these kids, 70% of these kids are going to come from a one-parent household, which is probably going to be a mother who is probably living with their grandparents, the mother's mother and father. And so they're going to see all this go on before they ever touch a math book or an English book.
Mm-hmm.
And so all these things are happening in their minds. And so when we send teachers into those environments, we have to send teachers into, we got to send our best of the best, and teachers who really understand how to teach within that culture, understanding all the elements of that culture. That is the key. I mean, when I first came back from the Army in 1988, my first job was a teaching job at Wheatley High School in Fifth Ward. And I would see teachers come in and stay one day and leave. And they were so glad to see me stick around. But, I was born right down the street there from the school. So it was a thing to come back to Houston and be there and be able to teach in that environment. But you see teachers come and stay one day and say, look, I didn't sign up for this. They have to send me somewhere else. And so the key is finding good teachers to place in those environments who understand that education goes far beyond the intelligence quotient, but also incorporate the environmental quotient into the total equation of being able to create a successful academic program and get the right outcomes. At the end of the day, you want the right outcomes. But here's one thing I'd like to pivot a little bit and talk about in that same context is career technology education. When I was coming up in school in the 70s, 60s and 70s, we had what was called vocational education. Now it's called career technology education. So for those students who did not want to go to college and get a liberal arts and science degree, they had vocational skills taught at our schools with a co-op relationship with industry. I'll give you a quick story. My good friend David stayed down the street from me. Both his mother was a teacher and his father was a principal in school. And both of my parents were from the cotton field here in Louisiana. And neither one had an 8th grade education, but they worked hard. Now, David loved drafting and he loved metal shop. So we had an agreement with Hughes Tools at the time that all the students who took drafting were taught how to design drill bits, and those students who took metal shop were taught how to read the design and build the drill bits and make the drill bits. And so when they graduated, they were offered high-paying jobs at Hughes Tools. Well, same situation. I went off to college on a basketball scholarship, and David went to work for Hughes Tools. And when I came home for the break, the second year, I came home for the Christmas break, David had purchased his first home and had a brand new car, and I had an old car. wishing I would have taken, trades in schools. But at the end of the day, my
Yeah.
point is we both became successful, and there was no road leading to prison. The roads were leading to either industry or higher education.
Is there a concern that let me back up and ask it this way, I guess. How is it determined which kids get into the career technology education as opposed to those who get on the college path, or of course, those who don't really get on either path and sort of by default end up on a path that not necessarily inevitably, but very, very likely leads to prison? How is it decided who gets in onto which path, or is it? I don't know. I guess how does that work? Is the real question I'm wondering about.
That's a wonderful question. I'm gonna tell you the reason why, because it really is open enrollment. The students can choose to take career technology courses. It's just their choice. But here's where we have the blockage. Largely in the African American community, there's been this perception that has been perpetuated by our leadership that taking trades is not noble. That every kid should go to college and earn a degree, a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, or a doctorate degree in liberal arts and sciences. And so that mindset has been put into the community and constantly reinforced in the African American community by the leadership. They hear it from politicians, they hear it from church leaders, they hear it from their parents, they hear it from community leaders. And so what ends up happening is you have very few African American students choosing to learn trades, and the larger portion are trying to prepare themselves to go to college, but have really no interest in the liberal arts and sciences. And so what ends up happening is we ended up having a high dropout rate with students saying, well, look, I'm not successful at school. I don't want to go to school. I'm dropping out because there's a trade that I can use right here on the streets. And in the large cities, usually it's going to be selling drugs or in that culture. And they're picking up the wrong trade and the wrong industry people. And so basically, if we change our mindset, then more African American students will choose to acquire a skill, a workforce development skill while they're in high school. And then if they choose to go on to college, which 70% of the ones who do choose to go on for some post-secondary education, and incidentally, 90% of the students who are concentrators and participate in CTE, 90% of those students graduate, and 70% of that cohort goes on to post-secondary education. So CTE, career technology education, is the way out for us. We just have to make that voice, that message ring louder in the Black community.
In so much of our society, the jobs that you mentioned, some are going to thrive being carpenters, some are going to thrive in all sorts of different trades that require hands-on work. We've almost stigmatized that kind of work and glorified. If you sit at a desk to do your job, then you're somehow better than people who work with their hands and do stuff that requires intelligence and knowing what to do, but you get dirty and sweaty sometimes. I'm sitting in an air-conditioned home that was built by a lot of people who got really dirty and really sweaty to make this happen. How do we change? Does the stigma exist on the trades in lower income neighborhoods, or is it seen differently there? And how does that perception of the different career paths play into making this work for people?
Well, when you say people, Mike, you're saying all people. Well, 65% of the students in Texas who take career technology education courses are white, and 20% are African American, and then the rest are pretty much, Hispanics. But 65%, which is the largest share of those students who take career technology education, are white. But so why is it that black people are telling black kids that you should not take those courses? You should not want to become a plumber. You should not want to become an electrician. You should not want to become a carpenter or a home builder. Why are we messaging, going to college, getting a bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degree in liberal arts and sciences, while still in some of our schools, 50% of the kids are dropping out of high school, going into the SchooltoPrison Pipeline and going straight to prison? I'd much rather send them to industry than to send them to the penitentiary.
And now let's take a quick break from this important discussion to tell you about Lovins Trosclair, which I hope is never an important part of your life. At Lovins Trosclair, which is my law firm and the sponsor of this program, we are personal responsibility lawyers. Most people would refer to us as personal injury trial lawyers, which is not false, but the term personal responsibility lawyer connotes the different approach that we take to trying cases to juries, which is to say that we attack the irresponsible decisions of people and companies that cause catastrophic injuries and sometimes even death. In doing so, we seek justice for our clients who have suffered the consequences of those irresponsible choices made by other people and companies. And that's why I hope our firm is never directly an important part of your life, because if we are, that means you have suffered terribly from someone else's irresponsibility. So while I certainly hope that you never ever need us, I've been around long enough to know that some people will need our services. If you are one of those who need us, please call us at 512-535-1649, or you can get more information about us at our website, www.ltlegalteam.com. That's L as in Lovins, T as in Trosclair, legalteam.com. We are here to help. When we were talking earlier, you talked about the pretty dramatic shift in the makeup of the American and specifically the African American family, and talk a little bit about that and what you see happening and its effects, and then what we can do, whether as policymakers or just as members of the community, to help that situation improve.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about the destruction of the black family, because if the family breaks down, the community breaks down. And if you go back and you look in 1965, there were only about 25% of the black children born in America, living in one-parent households, only 25%. And today, that number has gone to 70%. Over 70% of the black children that are born today live in a one-parent household. And usually it's going to be that mother or the mother and the grandparents, that nucleus. But, how did we get here? That's the question. And it's really a startling thing when you look at. I went back and I looked at when did they start the child support laws, and they launched the child support law in 1975. And when folks started getting a check, and they say, well, look, before they were getting that check or getting a welfare check, they would say, hey, let me see if I can work it out. Couples always have problems. There's not a perfect marriage out there between a man and a woman, because men and women are different. We're biologically different. Our chemical makeup is different. Our psyche is different. Everything about us is different. We're actually opposites. The male and the female, we're actually opposites. So what we try to do is find the yin and the yang and find a way to live together and move forward in a positive way. But that is a struggle. And so when government came in and said, well, look, I'm going to set up a system where a policy where, you know, if you decide to leave, man, you decide to leave your wife, wife, you decide to leave your husband, whoever the kids go to, the other one's going to send a check. And so, but not give the check to the from the man to the woman, but send the check to the government. Then the government sends the check to the woman. So there's if that takes that other person totally out of the picture, out of the family picture. You know, if I'm a man and my kids are with my ex-wife, I send a check to the attorney general's office, and the attorney general's office sends a check to my ex-wife, and then it may be months before I see kids or anybody, because there's no real incentive then to keep the man in the family. And so basically what ends up happening is a lot of women have said, look, this is a way I can live easy. You know, I don't have to go through the struggle of trying to make a marriage work, you know, so, and I'm going to get this money. I'm going to get paid. And so what ends up happening, we go from 25% single parent households to over 70% just from 1965 to now. So for people who were me and was born before 1965, I seen the days when most of the people I knew had a mom and dad living at home. And the government had not intruded into the family so significantly. But here again, look at the African American numbers. The African American females is about around 75%, right? Single family households. Hispanics are around 40%. White families is around about 24%. So if you have 24% of white families coming up in a single family household, that means most of their families are still intact. So their communities are intact. Same thing with Hispanics, which is about half. Half of them are still intact, so half of their community is intact. But if you look at the African American community, around 75% are not intact, so their communities are not intact. So your community cannot survive without family. And so here, that's why we have a high crime rate. We have a low academic performance rate, and we have a high rate of family dispersion.
So with the child support issue, I guess what's the change in policy to correct that? Because it doesn't seem that it is at least at first impression, I don't think it's a good idea to say, okay, now fathers who leave their families don't have to pay child support. How do we correct this so that it doesn't just let men who want to shirk their responsibilities off the hook and then leave the moms who are left to fend with, to support their children without any means of support?
Well, I coined a phrase years ago, and it hadn't gotten any traction, and it's called cooperatively parenting. Where 50% of the time the kids will live with one parent, and 50% of the time the kids will live with the other parent. Because, why should any one parent have the kids 100% of the time, when it's not necessary? When I was president of the 100 Black Men of Metropolitan Houston, which is an organization designed of successful Black men who want to give back through mentoring. In the summertime, we would have lines of Black females bringing their children to the 100 Black men to mentor them and be a surrogate father to them. And I kept seeing this year after year, so I asked a question one time. I said, well, where is his biological father? And so the mother said, well, he's in South Park. That's a community in Houston on Martin Luther King Drive. So I said, when was the last time that he saw his biological father? She said, well, 4 years ago. I said, well, is he in South Park on Martin Luther King in Atlanta or New York? She said, no, right here in Houston. So, I mean, his biological father lives right across town, and you've not taken him over to see his biological father in 4 years, but you bring him to me, who a guy you don't know. You don't really know me. You just know that I wear a suit and I look successful. And she said, well, I don't trust his father. I trust you. You just met me. You see, so what we have is situations where these parents, for whatever reason, don't get along. And you have all of that anger being filtered down to young black males because they're not engaged with their fathers. And so I started a program back then with the 100 saying that, look, we're going to bring fathers and sons together and bring and not spend all of our time trying to be surrogate parents to women who thought that we were just successful black men, and there was something attractive about that, and they didn't know us we were strangers to them. But you see how these kinds of things can happen when you don't have a policy that requires both parents to parent their children. Not one, but both parents to parent their children. And here's the thing, if one parent has the child for 50% of the time and the other parent has a child for the other 50% of the time, then why should and both of them are able bodies, why should either one of them have to pay either one of them any money?
A couple of things I wonder about on a couple of issues. Obviously, I'm gonna state the obvious here. I'm a white man.
Really?
How
that was a joke, man.
How much difference does it? How much difference does it make for a black kid to be mentored by a black man who he can look at and there's something about humans that, especially as kids, you see someone who looks like you, and it is at least initially, there's some sort of commonality, as opposed to seeing a white man and he says, well, yeah, but he's different from me. I can't, he doesn't probably consciously think this, but he's different from me. What he has to offer me isn't really for me. Is that how important is it for the mentors to young black kids to be black men or black women, for, as the situation is appropriate? But how much is the racial component important in mentoring, I guess, is maybe the more succinct way to ask my question.
I think the racial component is very important in terms of mentoring, but I think that distinction goes away when you compare it to no mentor at all. So it's better to have a positive role model in young people's lives, whether they're black, white, brown, or whatever their racial makeup may be. It's better to have a mentor involved, a positive mentor involved. Now, with that being said, it's even better to have more black males become mentors to young black males because there's a similarity. They see themselves. We have this saying in the 100, if you can see it, you can be it. So the idea is to get positive black males involved in young black males' lives. Now, that's even better. Now, what's the best? I'm going to give you the best. The best is for young black males to be mentored by their own father, by their own biological father.
Right.
And so one of the things that I shared with one of the mothers who would bring the many that would bring their sons to us, And she said to me, I don't trust him. He's not about anything. He's not like you guys. I said, wait a minute. There was a point in your relationship that you trusted him implicitly. And I said,
Yeah.
go back to that moment, go back to that guy, and find that the qualities that you saw in him then. And please do not be, mistaken just because we wear nice clothes and we drive nice cars, that means that we're the best people of character. That doesn't say anything for our character. And I said, we could never replace your son's father. So if you can put aside what your differences are and allow him to be just as much of a parent as you are, then you wouldn't need an organization like the 100 to be doing what it's doing in terms of surrogate parenting.
Let me close with this question. There are these men who are these absent fathers that you're talking about, that in so many cases they're not bad men. In fact, probably most cases, they're not at their core bad men. They have been caught in a school-to-prison pipeline. Many of them have spent time in prison, and then they come out virtually unemployable. And they're caught in a trap that may partially be of their own making, but to a great extent, they were not given opportunities to get on a path to being that made it, for so many of us, that it's easy to get into, relatively speaking, it's easy to get into being a productive member of society. But when you are put as a child on the school-to-prison pipeline, you don't have any agency in making that happen for yourself. And getting off of that path is an enormous task that I can recognize as enormous, while also recognizing I don't fully understand the gravity of that on a man's shoulders. How do we minister to those men? And when I say minister, I mean whether by policy, whether in a spiritual sense through church and community organizations. I don't know what the answer is, but how do we start tackling that problem to empower? Because many of these men, they didn't have their own father to mentor and raise them, and so that leaves them even more unequipped than those of us who did have fathers to try to mentor and raise our own kids. Where do we address that problem? What's at least a first step in doing that?
The first step is what I call go back to the future. In 1979, the state of Texas, which is a huge state, had 17 state prisons. By the year 2000, it had 137. When vocational education was taken out of the schools, that created a vacuum and delivered a failing school system, which created a huge thriving criminal justice system. It went into a boom state for prisons. So if you just reverse that, you drill down and you put career technology education back into the high schools. And then you marry those with industry. And for the guys who are already in the criminal justice system, you create that same, those second chance programs that bring them out of prison and into industry, where they're able to provide, jobs and live the great American dream. That's what everybody wants to do. And you have to make it less palatable for individuals to become single parent mothers, and as long as there's money involved, where they can get more money and don't have to work the work of being in a marriage, you're going to see numbers shoot up like they did. If we go from 1965, from 25% to now over 70%, And then the prison systems in 1979 in Texas, we had 17 state prisons. Year 2000, we had 137 state prisons. You know, the numbers are there. The outcomes are there. How do we reverse it? We reverse those policies. Some things we did in the past really worked well for us. We transformed those things to where we are now that have not worked well for us. And that's where you get a Joe Biden saying that, you know, the 1994 crime.
Unfortunately, this interview was terminated by some technical difficulties, which is why there is an abrupt ending. We were almost done, though, and this unceremonious ending doesn't diminish the value of the information that Dr. Johnson shared. Thank you so much for listening to The Personal Responsibility Lawyer, and I will see you next time. My guest today on The Personal Responsibility Lawyer has been Dr. Richard Johnson, the director of the Booker T. Washington Initiative at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Thank you for listening to the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast. You can get more information about the show, including my show notes, at the personal website, michaellovins.com. If you like what you've heard or if you've learned something interesting, please do me a massive favor and rate the show on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really does help. This episode of The Personal Responsibility Lawyer is brought to you by my law firm, Lovins Trosclair, where we use the civil justice system to hold people responsible for irresponsible choices when those irresponsible choices cause serious injuries and sometimes even death. We're personal injury trial lawyers, but I use the term personal responsibility lawyer because it connotes a different approach to presenting a case to a jury. I really, really hope that you never need a personal injury lawyer, but if you do, please call us before evidence gets lost or destroyed. You can reach my office at 512-535-1649. Tell us you heard about us on the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast. You can also go to our website for Lovins Trosclair at ltlegalteam.com. That's L as in Lovins, T as in Trosclair, legalteam.com. We are here to help. Now I have to do some disclaimers where I say stuff that you already knew, but that I must say anyway so that I keep the state bar happy. Here we go. This podcast is not legal advice. You listening to this podcast does not make me your lawyer or you my client. Neither does it make any of my guests your lawyer. If you want me to be your lawyer, contact me at my office. If I can represent you, we will execute a contract stating the specific terms under which I agree to represent you. I don't think you probably needed me to tell you that, but I did. Also, I'm not certified by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization as a personal responsibility lawyer because they don't have any idea what that is. Neither have they certified me in any other area of specialty that they actually do recognize. I think that wraps up our disclaimers for now. For Lovins Trosclair and the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast, I am Michael Lovins. We'll see you next time.